reservations all around. Yeah.
There's a lot to think about. Let's bring in employment attorney Helen Rella. Helen, we have so many questions for you. Let's start, though, with how unprecedented this is and where do companies even begin to think to wrap their head around all of these ideas and questions?
Well, it's highly unprecedented, Jamie. We've never seen anything like this, obviously, in modern times. We're fortunate because the federal, state, and local level governments have come together recognizing these difficulties in an effort to try to ensure that when we do go back to work, it's done safely and that the employer, the employees, and as well as the public at large are kept safe, because the worst thing that could happen would be having people go back to work and then precipitate additional virus and put us back to where we were before and then stall the reopening of the economy.
Helen, as you were saying before we went on the air, these laws are very complicated. What do employers, especially small employers, which are facing so many financial strains as it is, what are some of the main things that they need to know in terms of their employees' rights and how to safeguard them as they start to think about reopening?
Well, fortunately, the governor is issuing a phased reopening plan, and as each stage reopens, there will be guidelines that will be issued that hopefully will direct employers in how they may elect to proceed in order to safeguard employees in the workplace. I'm sure you've all heard of the proposition of having temperature checks as people enter buildings. There also are social distancing requirements, as well as providing employees with personal protective equipment, a term that, frankly, nobody ever heard of before and now is commonplace in our discussion of the workplace.
Helen, the transition here for people is going to be to decide what's safe, whether their assessment of safe is the same as their employers. I guess we should parcel this discussion because some people have work from home issues, and we can get to those. But if you're going to be returning to a workplace, if you're going to be going through a commute, if you're going to be getting into an elevator, as we were just talking about, you may not be as comfortable as your employer is. Some people are jumping to get back in, others are not.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And there are provisions, there are safety provisions relative to people who may be suffering from certain disabilities, people who, under the president's reopening plan, have been classified as vulnerable individuals, and employers will be working together with their employees in order to ensure that those people have particularized protections.
Do you think, am I wrong to assume that because it feels like there's going to be so many precautions and so many things that employers are worried about in terms of safety, that this might just prolong all of us going back to offices because they might just say, like, hey, all of this is just way too risky right now?
We don't anticipate at this point in time that we're going to see a situation where in each phase of reopening that the entire workforce comes back at once, because as Pat was saying earlier, it's just not practical. Even getting people in and out of an elevator that Annika was referring to presents a problem because social distancing seems to dictate that with a 6-foot apart requirement, you maybe would only have 1 or 2 people in an elevator at a time. So no, we don't anticipate everybody coming in all at once. And we do anticipate that more people will continue working from home because many people have found that that's viable alternative to actually being in the office place during a period of crisis such as this.
But when those companies and those types of businesses that are given the green light to reopen opt to do so because they haven't been making money or not the same type of revenue that they had been before they were forced to close down, a lot of them don't have the luxury to say, we're going to wait, we're going to keep people at home, because a lot of those businesses require people coming in to do whatever that might be. If you're one of those employees and your boss says, okay, lockdown's over, I need you to report to work on Monday, what kind of, I know you were talking about people with underlying health conditions may have some extra protections, but what if you don't feel comfortable? Can they force you to do that?
Well, fear is not something that's protected in the law. In order to assert that you need what we call an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has federal as well as ancillary state components, you actually have to show that you have a physical or mental impairment. and in order to request an accommodation from your employer. Otherwise, employment is governed by the terms and conditions set by the employer, and your employer could tell you you must report to work. And if you do not report to work, absent some basis to request any type of accommodation, you could lose your position.
A lot of questions coming in on social media here, Helen, so we'll get to some of them after a short break. You're watching One New York. Our topic today is employment and what your rights as a worker are and what your obligations as an employer are. We'll come back with more of your questions.
Welcome back to One New York on this Friday morning, where we are talking about employment. And Barbara tweeting, I'm scared to go back to my job because I'm the person who greets everybody in a 7-story office and rehearsal studio space. It's like a UN in there. We have no air circulating and the doors stay closed all day. No access to hot water to wash hands. Lots of people in my face.
We are joined by Helen Rella this morning, an employment attorney, and going over a lot of worker rights, do's and don'ts once offices and workplaces start to reopen. And that's a really good question, Helen. Is an employer required when they open, because we've heard about social distancing protocols in place, but what about providing a proper place to wash your hands?
Yes, well, the CDC recommendations provide specifically that employers should be providing appropriate PPE. That includes masks, that includes sanitizer, the ability for employees to wash hands. So Barbara's situation is somewhat unusual, since she's asserting that she doesn't have any of those things that are available to her. But certainly it would be good protocol, good form to follow to provide all of those things, because it's in no one's interest if people get sick or pass along the virus.
Helen, question from Victoria on Twitter, who's listening to this discussion and saying, what if I don't feel safe? What if I refuse to go in and essentially have to quit? Does she lose her unemployment eligibility on that basis?
Generally speaking, if an employee quits a job without good reason, and just quitting for a basis of fear is not theoretically good reason, then yes, she could lose her unemployment insurance benefits.
But I'm wondering, do you see any flexibility or any changes that might start to happen in some of these rules or laws or ways that we've always done things, because these are such extenuating circumstances?
Anything is possible. No one would have ever anticipated that something like this would have happened. And certainly the legislature has been moving very quickly in issuing different laws and amending things on a regular basis. So we don't know what we're going to see as the future comes down. I think once employees start to go back to work, we're going to see more protocols being issued and more guidelines. But certainly we can't have a situation where everybody says, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm not going back to work.
Right.
Yeah, this is so unprecedented that you would imagine that will continue to unfold and those questions will be answered in real time. I want to just respond to something that we heard from Ed on Twitter, because he is asking about some of these large corporations and whether they'll, instead of having their main corporate headquarters where everybody reports to work, that they'll have multiple small locations scattered around where their workforce lives instead of one large office space. I've already heard about at least one major New York employer that is open to doing that, and if people can find sort of a cluster of other colleagues that live where they live, that they could consider renting a space outside of the city. And I wonder what that might also do to New York's office space environment.
Well, look, the less people that you can have in any one space, the more you're complying with the social distancing requirements that the CDC has suggested. So there certainly is nothing prohibitive about that. But again, that's a decision that would be left to the employer. An employee or a group of employees could suggest it, but they certainly couldn't mandate it.
So, Helen, here's where you've got a potential dichotomy. There's the right thing in unusual circumstances, and then there's what employment law and other law permits. You've been in this business for a long time, not in pandemic circumstances, but when it comes down to it, do companies generally end up back at what the legal requirements are rather than taking some sort of path of their own?
I think that recognizing that the situation is unusual, as you noted, companies are doing what they can to try to accommodate people when they can. And again, keeping in mind that the end goal here is to restart the economy. But ultimately, a company can't put itself in a financial hardship situation by doing something that it's just not able to do. Going back to the example of one of your viewers regarding the differential office spaces, that sounds like a great idea, but perhaps it's just prohibitively expensive. So I think it's a balance between the economic considerations and the practical considerations in wanting to ensure that the workplace is safe.
There is a lot to think about here. Helen, stand by. We're continuing to take your questions and comments from Twitter and Facebook using the hashtag #OneNewYork. We're going to take a quick break and be right back.
We're back on One New York. Here's some of what is in place to protect families and workers as we have been through the first 2 months of this pandemic. In the middle of March, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was passed. It created some leave options for employees, paid sick time, and so forth. It was for private employers with fewer than 500 employees. There were some exemptions for smaller businesses. And then the Emergency Family Medical Leave Expansion Act was also put into effect, creating situations where there was an opportunity for taking time off if there was documentation of that. So there are some temporary changes to what the relationship between employee and employer is, but it really remains to be seen how much of this stays and how much those protections will continue in the months ahead.
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. We're joined by Helen Rella, an employment attorney, to get to the heart of some of what we do know at this point. And one thing that I was wondering about, just looking at that full frame there, Helen, is what if you don't feel safe and you haven't used your Family Medical Leave Act days? Can you say you are going to stay home for a period of time, or would your employer have the right to force you to go in? If you don't feel safe, I know you were talking about before, then you could potentially lose your job, but what about using the Family Medical Leave Act for that?
Okay, so the Family and Medical Leave Act and the CARES Act provisions are tied to the coronavirus. So the initial 2 weeks of paid leave was slated for people who either were subject to an order of quarantine or who were ill from the virus, and the expansion provisions relate, again, to the coronavirus and also extend leave periods for individuals who have to stay home in order to care for a child because either the child care provider or the child care facility is not available or schools are closed. It's not a blanket provision that just allows everyone to have family and medical leave. It's still under the auspices of the Family and Medical Leave Act that requires that you have some condition that allows you to take leave.
That brings us right to this question on Facebook. Carlos is asking, and I've heard this from a lot of people wondering about what happens if you have kids without childcare and you're unable to work, what happens then?
Well, that is one of the provisions that is covered under these expanded Family and Medical Leave Act provisions. An employee can take an additional 10 weeks of leave in order to care for the child because of the school closure, the child care closure, or the unavailability of the child care provider. So that is one of the covered elements.
Helen, Michael on Twitter coming at this from the employer's perspective, saying you take precautions at work as the employer, you buy the PPE, somebody still refuses. Michael asks, what's the employer's recourse in that situation? If they won't come in, can you hire somebody else?
If an employee refuses now to come to work under the current regulations, and there hasn't been an amendment to this yet, and there is no basis for the employee to seek an accommodation because they're claiming that they have some sort of a mental or physical disability. For example, if they're in the vulnerable population of somebody who could be at increased risk for contracting the virus, then unfortunately, if they do not return to work, they can be deemed to have resigned from their position.
Helen, we have so many questions coming in for you on Twitter and Facebook. We have to take a quick break, but we'll get to some of them when we come back. Remember, the hashtag to use to ask a question is OneNewYork. Stay with us.
Meantime, 9:30 on this Friday morning, we are joined on One New York by employment attorney Hellen Rella. And Helen, I want to read this tweet to you and bring something up that's come up from a bunch of people writing into our show. This is from Emily, who says, the cost to at-home workers had to be addressed. Owners can't save money on office space and pass those costs on to employees. A lot of people are wondering, as long as work from home continues, or if it continues for some companies in perpetuity, what sort of things can they expect, or what sorts of things are employers required to do in terms of a stipend for things like a chair or a desk, or supplementing their Wi-Fi or broadband costs?
I think employers, in the spirit of wanting to keep everybody safe and to keep their workforce in place, are looking at all of these things and are helping in any way that they can across the board. In terms of what they're obligated to do, again, if you have a situation where somebody is claiming that they need an accommodation and must work from home, then it would be reasonable for an employer to assist in perhaps providing an ergonomically correct chair for somebody who's got a back issue, or a wrist brace for someone who's got carpal tunnel. But in terms of absorbing the full cost of having an employee work at home, there are no regulations that mandate that at this time. I think generally speaking, employees are happy to be in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, some are happy now, some are happy going forward and would like that situation to continue. Right. But I guess some of this is in the legal arena, and some of it is in the arena that you need to just open a conversation, which for some employees is something that they're better equipped to do than others. If you're in a small company, you can say to your boss, well, look, maybe we should make this permanent. Maybe I should just set up a home office. Is there a way that you can be compensated for what they're saving on real estate? But other companies aren't as flexible, and other people aren't as good at opening that conversation, or maybe their boss isn't empowered to be the one to make any changes.
Right, sure. Well, Pat, look, in terms of the real estate, the employer is still maintaining the office space, even though an employee is working from home. So it's not as though that the employer shut down the workforce in total, or has vacated their office space and doesn't have those expenses. But again, I think as we move forward and we move into these various phases where more people are going to face the issue of either staying and working from home as opposed to coming back to the office, that we may see more accommodations coming down the road. Not in the form of legal requirements, but in the form of concessions from employers to employees.
It's interesting, Helen, that you bring up that they are still paying and maintaining that office space. For now, I think what's going to be very interesting to see is what happens to all of the millions of square feet of office space in New York City, and will companies start scaling back or trying to get out of their leases or not renewing their leases? And it's also worth pointing out, and I wonder if you could talk to this a little bit, when you work at home and you start incurring these expenses, you might not be getting them back in a direct payment from your company in terms of an expense report, but this is all tax deductible, and it's worth reminding people that they don't have to pay the cost and just eat everything.
Sure. And again, they can engage in an interactive discussion with their employer as to what expenses the employer might consider to be reimbursable. And one of the things that you just pointed out in terms of reconfiguring the office space, those, of course, are all costs that an employer is going to have to incur. I'm sure you're aware that the open office concept was very popular before the virus hit. That's now out the window. So we do see...
And that was very cost effective.
Yes, that's exactly right. And now it's becoming not cost effective because we're looking at reconfiguring the spaces into closed office areas, or even on a temporary basis. What we're hearing are companies considering putting plexiglass dividers up between these open office stations in order to try to mitigate the damage potentially caused by too close of a proximity between the workers.
Helen, I'm just curious as I look at you with the books behind you and everything in your work from home world. In your career, what's the longest you've ever gone without actually being in the office surrounded by colleagues? This is new to all of us.
2 weeks on a vacation. That's it. This is quite odd. Quite odd indeed.
And I think a lot of people, the vacation point. the days off, the vacation, the sick leave, the paid leave, all of those things, those are big questions now that a lot of people who have been lucky enough to still have jobs are wondering about going forward with. Will they be paid out for some of that time if they don't use it? A lot of people I know are, first of all, they're not sure what they would do with any time off right now. Where are they going? But also they're a little bit timid about asking for time off right now because it's just a weird time.
Well, look, in order to analyze time off, an employee would need to take a look at what their employer's vacation policy is. Because generally speaking, vacation days are accrued. And when those days are accrued, they're deemed to be earned. And under the law, they're viewed as wages. So that means that there's a legal entitlement to them. So certainly an employee could feel free to take time off. And this is particularly important in instances where an employer might have a use it or lose it policy. You certainly wouldn't want to forego that. But again, I anticipate that as we move forward in this strange environment, that there are going to be more interactive discussions between employers and employees in order to try to address these issues as they're coming up.
And Helen, employers are trying to put in a lot stricter protocols even beyond what the government suggests to keep their employees and potentially their customers safe. I'm wondering if the time comes that we do have a vaccine, will an employer have the right to mandate that an employee gets a vaccine in order to return to work? I mean, where do your rights fall within that scope?
You know, this is a difficult question, and the thinking is that they will be able to do that. But of course, there are certain groups of people, particularly certain religious faiths, that prohibit vaccinations. So all of those things are going to have to be taken into consideration. You know, we're not there yet. And as I said earlier, I think as this unfolds, we're going to see more guidelines from the CDC, from the federal, state, and local governments on how we're going to proceed.
Helen, on Facebook, Thomas is asking the question about older employees. We know that the coronavirus and COVID-19 attacks older people with more severity than younger people, but does a precaution turn into age discrimination?
Well, you know, in order to have an age discrimination claim, you actually have to take some detrimental action against someone based upon their age. Under the federal administration's Get Back to Work plan, vulnerable individuals are considered those who are 60 or older. The older population is considered as part of that. And those individuals, the suggestion is, should not return to work and should be allowed to work remotely until a later phase of the reopening, where we're more secure that we're not going to be faced with a continued spread of the virus. So I don't think it would be age discrimination to tell an employee that no, they may or they may not come back to work based on age, as long as these decisions are applied in an even-handed basis. In other words, you wouldn't say, okay, all the older workers, you stay home, all the younger workers, you come back to work. That would be an impermissible activity on the part of an employer.
And then we've already seen a lot of this happening across lots of different industries, but people are worried about pay cuts or even having their hours cut. And if an employer, says across the board, this is what you're going to make now, or people making above a certain amount, they're going to have their salary cut by a certain amount, is there anything that an employee can do, or this is just, it is what it is because the employers have new and different costs now?
Well, the employer, again, has the right to set the terms and conditions of employment. And one term and condition of employment is the wage rate that an employee is being paid. So absent a contract of employment that spells out what you are to be paid and the circumstances of reducing the wage, or something like a collective bargaining agreement that pertains to unionized workers, the employer has the absolute right to change the salary that an employee is making.
Helen, stand by. We have a lot more comments on Facebook and Twitter. We hope that we're going to get a chance to ask them to you. We have to take a quick break. We want to remind people that the mayor's scheduled 9:30 press conference usually starts around 9:42. It's even started as late as 9:50. Hopefully we'll have some more time with you, Helen, after the break. This is One New York.
At 9:42, welcome back to One New York. As we have mentioned, we are awaiting Mayor de Blasio's daily coronavirus briefing. Helen Rella is with us, an employment lawyer, talking about what you need to know as an employee, what you need to know as an employer as we get into the next phase, Annika, of reopening business.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, and I think one thing that I've gleaned from Helen is because this is changing day by day, the issues that come up are changing as well. And employers, most of them, which are not open yet, haven't fully rolled out what their offices will look like. So a lot of people don't know what they're going to be facing when they go back to work. Helen, I wanted to also ask you, because we might get cut off by the mayor, if you could just leave people with some words that might be helpful that they need to know as they start thinking about going back into their place of work. What do you think is the big picture that people should remember and take with them?
Well, with respect to the employees, I think what we've taken away, particularly from some of the questions that we've heard from your viewers, is the notion that employees should feel free to speak with their employer and to raise the concerns that they have. And hopefully we'll see a situation where employers are going to be working cooperatively, because everybody's interest here is served by ensuring that we come back to work in a safe and efficient manner. With respect to the employers, I would say if you have issues relating to how you're going to handle your employees coming back to work, seek the advice of competent legal counsel. And what we've tried to do today here is to give an overview, but of course it's not particularized legal advice because situations change. But as everybody can appreciate, this is a very complicated scenario. There are a myriad of laws that are already in place that impact this issue, and there are laws coming down on a regular basis trying to solve the problems that we're facing. So those are very important points. But please don't be afraid to speak with your employer, the employees out there that have some concerns regarding the virus, because we're all in this together, and what we're looking for is to be able to open the economy successfully and safely so we can all get back to work and prosper.
Yeah, it all comes back to communication, right? And I feel like we've heard
Absolutely.
that from all the various experts across all the industries. I still remember Farnoosh, a personal finance expert we had on, I don't know, probably a month or two ago now,
Right.
who was saying, ask the people who you're getting bills from, open that conversation with them because they're in a new situation too, and you never know
Right.
what someone might allow that they otherwise didn't allow before.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Because again, this is so odd. We haven't had a pandemic like this in an extraordinarily long time, and we're all dealing with it on a daily basis. And I truly believe that everyone, both the employer and the employees, are doing the best they can under certainly difficult circumstances.
Helen, Michelle on Facebook asks for unionized employees. Are they on a different footing in some of these discussions? Helen, I'm asking you the question, and I'm told in my ear that the mayor has just stepped up to the podium. So we'll have to take a break from this discussion. Helen, we appreciate you being with us.
Thank you for
Jamie
having
and
me,
Annika,
Pat.
we will leave this behind and take you to Mayor de Blasio for this.